Okay, thank you very much, and we'll let Ed start.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And this is not the graveyard shift. That's at 3 o'clock. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. So as Jimmy Buffett says, we all got them. We all want them. Now, what do we do with them? And we're going to talk about aging power plants. Okay, so this is a topic that deserves a safety moment, and I want to talk about another project over in England that has turned out to be quite a disaster, but it sort of illustrates the biggest risk on dealing with these old power plants is structural failures, and there have been some in the United States, but I want to focus on this one, which occurred over in Great Britain within the last 6 months, I think in February. So you have a big power plant, a well-regarded owner, an experienced demolition contractor who prepared an old coal plant for demolition that they were going to implode using shaped charges. Before they got a chance to implode the facility, it collapsed. And there's some speculation that they had cut some of the members, which we would not do in this country, but nevertheless, the structure collapsed. There were 4 people inside the structure. 1 of the bodies was recovered. 3 of the bodies have not been recovered because you have this huge pile of mangled steel in place, and now the British government is bringing in the military to help in the recovery process. So one of the best practices, lessons learned, that we like to continually remind people of is the need to evaluate these structures before you put people in them, either to do pre-bid walks or to do physical work. But these are old structures. Some of them are in great shape, some of them are severely corroded. But in order to protect workers and the public ourselves when we go through them, structural evaluation is a very important step in the process. So now we talk about the broader market, and the U.S. commercial power generation, about 1,000 gigawatts of generating capacity. The system is set up with reserve margins of 15%. Some regions of the country have more than 15%, 25, maybe more percent reserve margin. Closures have been announced for something like 200 sites. I've been giving this talk for a while, and the number was always 150 sites. But in the last 6 months, there have been additional closures announced, probably as a result of smaller plants that were impacted by MATs. The old number for capacity closures was 60 gigawatts. The news reports are talking about 102 megawatts of closures announced. And I think most of those plants have ceased operations at this time. Our friends at the Sierra Club are not satisfied yet. They have a program that is targeting another 290 sites and another 240 megawatts of coal-fired capacity. I'm not sure that we ever had that many coal-fired power plants in the country, but that's Sierra Club's current target. And then the last bullet is there's recently an interesting article which describes America's power plant problem, where we have all these facilities that have produced power for the benefit of the American public and the economy for 40, 50, 60 years, and they've ceased operating, but then nothing happens. They sit there, they may or may not get sold, they may or may not get asbestos abatement, they may or may not get demolished, but they just kind of sit there, and the economy and the community is deprived of a site that produced tremendous economic benefit for a long time. So that is an emerging issue that I expect we will hear more about. This slide, I apologize, it's difficult to read, but 2015 additions and deletions. A lot of renewable additions, a lot of coal-fired deletions or closures, and if you look at the upper map, a lot of the closures are kind of clustered in the Ohio River Valley and the upper Midwest. If you look at the lower map, there's all these yellow dots, which tend to be in California and North Carolina, and those are solar additions. I was surprised that there was that much solar capacity added in the Carolinas in particular. But some of this investment money came from private sources, some of it came from ARRA money. But nevertheless, those are the statistics for 2015. Come on. Okay. So economic drivers, and we've heard this more than once. Why do you want to close the plant? We're losing money every day. It costs money for the plant to sit there. Some plants may or may not get capacity payments. Some plants may or may not be producing power, but a lot of plants are closed because they are losing money every day for their owners. The other big economic drivers are low gas prices and these fabulous heat rates that come out of new combined cycle gas plants, which are keep getting better. In this market, depending on which part of the country you're in, low price tends to win. You may get capacity payments. You may sell a lot more power if you're the low price provider. If you're the high price provider, you have less of a chance of clearing auction, less of a chance of getting capacity payments, and you get dispatched later in the stack than the low cost provider. So it is a deregulated market where the low cost wins. Carry costs, just because the plant is not running doesn't mean the costs go away. Property taxes, security, legacy, environmental, you still need to do all those things while the doors are still open, and those costs continue until something changes. Another economic driver is capital avoidance for pollution control systems. If you add up the list of pollution controls that you might have to install on an old power plant, you might be able to build a brand new one for less than the cost of a full set of pollution controls. Abatement and demolition costs, they kind of go the other way. If you do close the plant, those costs may become required. Salvage, scrap, and real estate are offsets to abatement and demolition costs. Depending on the value of scrap and the value of the real estate, they may or may not be enough to cover the cost of abatement and demo. Usually not. We like to see companies use cash flow models to evaluate the different options that are available to them. It's the only way to know how to pay. It's the only way to make the right choice. We're losing power on our. Okay, levelized cost of electricity. This is another chart that's difficult to read, but you'll get a copy of it. Over the life of a project, the cheapest form of energy is geothermal, but combined cycle gas turbine at this time is just about there, and everything else is more expensive. And that's why you see all this market share going to combined cycle gas turbine. There are PPAs being given for solar and wind that are competitive with new gas plants, but a certain amount of that is probably based on tax subsidies, which may or may not last forever. Probably not last forever. So this is another, if you have an old plant, steam turbine technology, this is just another battle to fight that's working against you in this economic climate. Environmental drivers, we've talked a lot about today, but I'm used to seeing the train wreck slide, and the industry did a really good job of resisting regulation for a long time. But within the last 5 years, MATS, cooling water intake and discharge, coal combustion residues, maybe the Clean Power Plan, all these regs have become final. They've been litigated, they've been challenged. MATS has survived one Supreme Court challenge. it looks like they're here to stay, and by the time, and economics, really economics has had more to do with the changes in the power generation industry, I think, than environmental regulations have. But now we talk about what do we do with all these sites that have closed. And it's always good to set goals. So you know, safety is always a goal. Protecting the health and safety of workers and the public has always got to be a primary goal. We spend a lot of energy and money on looking at things like asbestos and hazardous materials and PCBs, but the real risk here is structural and trucking, conventional safety risks covered in OSHA Subpart T, for those of you who are interested in that kind of detail. Second goal is always cost. These are, you know, power companies are economic organizations. Minimize carry costs, maximize asset valuation, manage decommissioning costs as best you can. Companies don't really have the ability to set up reserves for decommissioning costs, except for asbestos abatement and things like PCBs and coal ash. There needs to be a regulatory requirement to set a reserve. I guess a corporate board could determine that they want to spend the money and set up a reserve, but most companies don't have huge reserves set aside for power plant decommissioning. The schedule for decommissioning a plant, 18 to 30 months after you begin work. A redevelopment cycle could be a couple of years, it could be 25 years, could be forever. But the redevelopment cycle, unless someone is pushing it, driving it, it can take a long time. And then finally, there's a quality goal, which I like to describe as meeting stakeholder requirements. And in the world of power plant closures, there's lots and lots of stakeholders, some of which have a legitimate role to play, and others are just kind of telling you how they feel and what they think. But you have to engage with the stakeholders. On redevelopment sites, the stakeholders usually want to know, what are you going to do with, what are you going to build there? They don't really care so much about how are you going to take it down, but they do care about future use. And then meeting their requirements, people have wish lists, and then there are requirements. It's important to meet people's requirements, and then you can consider the wish lists on a case-by-case basis. So current business models, just going across the photos on top, Austin Energy Holly Street plant. It was in a Austin Energy is a municipal utility, a little blue dot in a big red state, very community conscious. Austin Energy decided to take this plant down and convert it into a number of different future uses. Part of it is park, part of it is commercial, part of it is a switchyard. The second one is a power generation site out near JFK Airport in Queens. It was an old coal plant, then it was a newer coal plant, and then there's two peakers, and we took down the second coal plant, and that site is available for new gen, which may or may not get built. The site on the far right is a big site in Midtown Manhattan, which is sort of a unique opportunity, but you have 10 acres on the waterfront in a city. The redevelopment potential is huge, and the plant was taken down. Redevelopment is underway, but it's taken quite some time to get there. The other options are, you know, leave it where it is and do nothing, or sell it to someone else. A lot of times the buyers are scrap dealers that want to buy the site for scrap. They tend to take the scrap and then leave. So we like to say you need a playbook to understand your options, and they can be complex, but if you make the right choice up front, you're going to have a better outcome at the back end. Okay, so there are best practices for retirement projects. And there was no consensus on this about 3 or 4 years ago. There's been a lot of seminars and meetings, and there's been quite a few projects done. So there are a series of best practices that involve both engineering, construction or deconstruction, and then future use, which we'll get into on the other slides. But we think it's important to do some engineering up front. It doesn't cost a whole lot of money, but structural safety, regulated material surveys for asbestos and other hazardous materials like lead and PCBs and mercury. Permit determinations, you do need permits to take down old plants. They've become fairly well recognized. It's important to come up with a set of plans and specs that define what a contractor would need to do so you can get a good set of competitive bids. It's important to have an asset recovery strategy. Does the owner want to keep the scrap? Do they want to put the scrap with the demo guy? Millions of the scrap is worth anywhere from $2 to $10 million for a typical power plant, depending on the markets, but it's a lot of money at stake. Pre-qualifying contractors for experience, safety, financials, stakeholder engagement, a community relations plan, if you want to call it that, and then a cost estimate and schedule. These are really important steps to be taken up front in order to set up a project for success. If you just turn it over to a contractor's going to do what's good for the contractor and not necessarily good for the owner or for the community. When it comes time to perform the work, you just got to beat the safety, health, and environmental drum over and over and over. Utility disconnects, air gapping utilities. Nobody wants to cut a live wire or a live gas line during a demolition project. Abatement, demo, and restoration speak for themselves. Asset recovery. If the markets are soft, contractors will like to pile up the scrap and leave it there for a time when the markets get better. You may or may not be able to deal with that. So that needs to be specified in a contract. Remediation, construction management, project controls, and documentation. For those of you who are in regulated states, you may be able to recover the cost of decommissioning in a rate filing. It's important to have the right documentation, depending on how your Public Service Commission structures their rate recovery requests. And then finally, closeout. We've got $100,000 worth of computers in this room, and we need a couple of AA batteries. Maybe that'll help. No. I don't even know where to advance this. Is there a... Oh, you have them with you. That's great. Nope. Okay. Let's just, I'll just ad-lib it from here. So retrofits are kind of grouped in two categories, gas conversions and then scrubber retrofits. There's a number of gas conversions that are taking place now around the country. And hey, how about that? Great. And as shown by the red dots, tricks to one of our clients puts the price of a gas conversion at $50 million. It's a lot of money. A lot of the cost is bringing in the gas. often borne by the gas pipeline company. But then you have to retrofit the boilers, and that is a skill set that just a few companies are selling. Coal to gas, dual fuel, what about permits, code requirements? Do you have to deal with the building? Do you have to tear apart, remove a lot of old equipment from the boiler itself? But these gas retrofits do allow you to avoid the capital cost of scrubbing, the operating cost of scrubbing, and they allow you to keep running your plant into the future, which you may not be able to do if you're burning coal. Redevelopment, we love these projects because, as Bill said, you have large consolidated properties on the water near load centers, which may be cities or industrial corridors, and you just don't have that many sites like that around anymore. The fact that there's an old power plant on that site may make it a good site for a new power plant, or it may make it a good site for something else like a port or a mixed-use development. So here's where the real estate people can add a lot of value. Commercial real estate professionals can do valuation studies, highest and best use studies. They can be really, really valuable studies for an owner to engage. There needs to be, and so you stop there and you say, well, the property's worth $10 million, $20 million, nothing. But at least you have a sense of what the property would be worth in the market where the property sits. There needs to be sufficient due diligence to enable a sale. A lot of sales are done with investment capital, and investors want to know what they're buying, so you may need to do a phase one or a phase two. You may not, some companies don't want to do that. They don't want to know, if you want it, buy it, we're not doing the study. And then you get into a whole range of responses to that issue. The buyers should, and I think they do, price in decommissioning and known remediation. They can consider environmental insurance, a PLL, for unknown remediation requirements. And the other good thing that developers have is they have access to money that sellers don't necessarily have access to, like grants, loans, indemnities, brownfield development programs, and those things can be really, really great. Okay, so paying for a transition to clean energy, where are you going to get the money to do the work that needs to be done? So asset retirement obligations, there may be reserves set up on the books, they may not be adequate, but there might be AROs set aside for performing decommissioning work. For those of you who own plants in regulated states, rate-based recovery is an option, subject to Public Service Commission approval. They may or may not want to approve the money. They may prefer that you sell it as is. Cash flow, the shareholders pay in deregulated states, and the price that gets paid is offset by asset recovery from the sale of scrap or real estate. We've been involved in a couple of projects where the sale of real estate completely was hundreds of millions of dollars more than the cost of decommissioning. That is not the usual case. Investment capital, there is a lot of private equity money available for investment. There needs to be a case made for why this site is a good investment for that capital, but there is money available for certainly real estate projects. Unfortunately, or somebody has to pay for this, and the owner usually has to write a big check. If your site is in the relatively new, not too much asbestos, an open structure, good scrap market, low-cost labor market, you have a greater chance of doing these projects for no cash. If you're in the upper Midwest, where you have a building, a lot of asbestos, and so on and so forth, an expensive labor market, the cost is going to be, probably in the 8-figure range. New trends, private equity, we talked about a little bit. The picture on the right, Bill had referred to, it's a site on the river in Philadelphia, and that site is supposed to be redeveloped. It was sold, and the developer wants to develop it as a destination real estate, a conference center or a banquet center or something like that. It's kind of an interesting future use. There is also a trend towards organized government support to redevelop these old generating sites. The state of Pennsylvania is kind of out front of many other states, and part of the logic is that the in this case coal-fired power plant industry enabled the United States to get where it is today, and why should they be penalized today just because they have all these old coal plants? So maybe there should be some government support for decommissioning and redevelopment of these old generating sites. Economic development zones can be really powerful tools for encouraging development. And then there's brownfield cleanup programs like New York and like Pennsylvania and many other states that allow you to set achievable goals for cleanup, particularly for low-level metals that you might find on an old coal site. So here's our last slide. It's life after coal. So it's interesting to me that you see this precipitous decline in coal-fired generating capacity, but it is supposed to level off at around 30% of the market for the foreseeable future, which means decades. Gas generation is supposed to peak around 2025, at which point solar and wind would become so cost compelling that they would become a major part of the system with battery storage backup. So we'll see, and we'll see what happens. But if you are talking about coal-fired power plants, they're all going to have scrubbers, they're all going to have NOx, SOx, particulate recovery, CO2, I'm not so sure, closed cycle cooling systems, carbon pricing through cap and trade. That's kind of better than carbon sequestration, but we'll let Tom tell us about that in a later talk. And that is it. So, any questions for anyone? Thank you.
Question or comment?
Okay. Yes.
For the plants that essentially just sit there, who has jurisdiction over that? Because we've seen that exercised in a number of ways. For example, up in Boston, plant we were talking about was the fire chief. Fire department has, under the fire code, has responsibility to ensure that abandoned or retired buildings are maintained in a safe fashion. Have you had a lot of experience with that?
Right. So this is a great question, and it's really a great question because if all the government entities all do their job, the fire department has jurisdiction over the fire protection systems, and the local building department has construction code compliance, and the environmental agencies have air, water, and solid waste. And so if they all do their jobs, they can come in and audit you and make sure that you're in compliance with their requirements. The elevator is a classic one. You've failed your elevator inspection. We haven't used the elevator in 10 years, right? So these are all continuing obligations unless something is condemned, and even then you have to comply with the continuing requirements. But so here comes the other part of this. Unless there is a municipal ordinance that requires you to demolish a facility, there's no national or state law that requires you to decommission a power plant after it ceases operations. And it's a problem. I don't have to do it, so why should I spend all this money? And that's one of the contributing factors to the what we're calling America's power plant problem, where all these places are sitting around. So to those companies who have taken the steps to take these facilities out of service, decommission them, I think that's great. You set them up for future use and economic benefit to the communities. You avoid an attractive nuisance. But it takes you're spending money and performing work to get there. For a lot of the others, they just sit there for decades, which is tough.
Yeah, we found security to be a problem in terms of scavengers going in and trying to get access to scrap metals and things like that. In fact, we have to be careful, and they have to be careful, because a lot of these facilities still have functioning substations, switch yards and stuff. So I've actually seen it at some of our stations where wires have been taken and stripped off, and then it gets to a point where the connection to the substation starts, and there's a big sign that says, "Please do not cut into this line. It is a live line." You will likely be electrocuted if you want to take that line. One other observation, one of the more interesting uses that I've seen of one of these plants is our Richmond plant, which is just north of that Delaware station, was actually this location that they used to film the Bruce Willis post-apocalyptic movie 12 Monkeys. Mm-hmm. So anytime that genre comes back, some of these power plants, and the conditions that they're in make a suitable backdrop for that. So, yeah. Thanks. Very, very informative presentation. It's an issue that doesn't get a lot of thought. We were shocked at the point that Ed made about there's no laws that require to take this building down. And so when the asset retirement obligation first kicked in, our accountants were incredulous. They're saying, "You mean we don't have to knock that building down?" No, you don't. Just put a fence up around it, maintain the security. And he said, do you ever have to knock it down? I said, not really. And so that's where the asset retirement aspect sits with respect to that. So a lot of unique and interesting and some really neat challenges there.
There are.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.